The ward was always quiet at night, too quiet for comfort. Machines hummed softly, glowing screens blinked, and the faint smell of medicine filled the air. Most of the patients were unconscious, kept asleep by heavy drugs, their weak bodies tied to monitors. For the alien nurse Lyra, this silence had become her world, a world of shadows, whispers, and forgotten lives. She moved carefully from bed to bed, her silver hands glowing faintly under the sterile lights. Her kind was trained to heal, but never to speak too much, never to get close. Patients came and went, but no one ever looked at her as more than just another nurse. She was background, invisible, part of the cold walls of the ward. But that night, everything changed. The doors slid open with a hiss, and guards dragged in a human soldier, bleeding, broken, half-conscious. Humans were rare here, feared, even hated, and when one arrived, it meant trouble. The guards dumped him on the bed as if throwing a corpse, and one of them sneered, "Keep him alive. Nurse, but don't let him speak too much, he's dangerous." Lyra swallowed hard, nodding without words. She turned back to the man, her eyes soft but cautious. His face was pale, his skin rougher than any alien she had treated before. A deep gash cut across his chest, and his breathing came in shallow bursts. For a moment she thought he would not last the night. She reached for her tools, cleaning the blood with gentle hands. The human groaned, his body tensing, and then, suddenly, his eyes opened. Not dull, not empty, but sharp, alive, filled with fire. Lyra froze, her breath caught in her throat. Every tale she had ever heard about humans came rushing back. They were fighters, rebels, survivors, never to be trusted. The man's lips trembled, dry and cracked, yet he forced out words. "Don't trust them," he whispered, his voice weak but heavy with warning. Lyra blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked in the softest voice, but before she could hear more, his eyes rolled back, and he slipped into unconsciousness again. Her heart pounded in her chest. She looked at the doors, at the guards who stood outside, waiting, watching. She remembered their words. Keep him alive. Don't let him speak. Why would they fear his voice more than his strength? Why would a dying soldier warn her instead of begging for help? The night stretched long, and every sound echoed louder than usual. The hum of the machines, the drip of medicine, the soldiers' shallow breaths. Lyra found herself sitting closer to his bed, her eyes drawn again and again to his face. He was not like her people, not like the others in the ward. There was something in the way his hand twitched, as if even in pain he wanted to fight. She whispered to herself, "Why warn me? What did you see that I cannot?" Her voice trembled in the stillness. The human stirred, turning slightly as if he had heard her even in sleep. Lyra quickly pulled the blanket over him, her hands shaking. She told herself she was only doing her duty. But in her heart, she knew it was something more. The silence of the ward pressed down on her, but inside she was no longer calm. Doubt grew like a storm, questions she dared not speak out loud. What danger hid behind the guard's smiles? What truth was this soldier carrying that others wanted buried? And why, out of all beings in the galaxy, had he chosen to warn her, an alien nurse no one noticed? When her shift was supposed to end, she did not leave. She stayed by his bed, listening to his breaths, waiting for his eyes to open again. And in that moment, under the pale light of the silent ward, Lyra realized the quiet life she knew was about to break. Something had begun tonight, something that would not end with morning, because for the first time in her life, a human had spoken to her not as a tool, not as a shadow, but as someone he trusted. And that truth left her heart racing, her mind restless, and her soul awake in the silence. The next night, the ward was not as quiet as before. The hum of the machines seemed sharper, the shadows heavier, and Lyra's heart refused to settle. She told herself she would not look at the human again, she would just do her duty and move on. But as soon as she stepped close to his bed, his eyes opened, burning, alive, watching her. She gasped and almost dropped her tray. The human soldier did not blink, did not look away. There was no weakness in those eyes, only a heavy truth she could not name. It was as if he saw straight through her skin and into her soul. Lyra whispered, "You are awake," her voice shaking. The man's lips curved into something between a grimace and a smile. "Alive. For now," he rasped, his voice rough but clear. She wanted to ask him to stay silent, to close his eyes, but the words would not leave her tongue. Instead, he lifted a trembling hand, pointing weakly toward the hall, toward the guards outside. His voice was thin but sharp as a blade. "Don't trust them," he said again, stronger this time. Her chest tightened. "Why do you keep saying that?" she whispered, leaning close. His gaze locked on hers, and in those eyes she saw not madness but certainty. "They want me dead," he breathed. "But not too fast, not before I talk, not before they break me." His words made her blood run cold. This ward was supposed to heal the wounded, not torture them. Yet his eyes told her he was not lying. She hesitated, looking around as if walls could hear. "You should rest," she said softly, but her own voice betrayed doubt. The human shook his head weakly, his hair sticking to his sweat. "Rest means death here." "Listen to me," he whispered. "I survived battles. I survived fire and steel, but I cannot survive betrayal from inside these walls." Lyra's fingers tightened around the tray. Every instinct told her to walk away, to forget his words. But something in the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, held her still. He was not begging for pity. He was warning her as if she mattered, and that was something no patient had ever done. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Only the steady beep of the monitor filled the space. Then she asked in a trembling voice, "Why warn me? I am nothing to you." His cracked lips curled into the faintest smile. "Because you listened," he said, his voice barely a whisper but heavy as stone. Her heart stuttered in her chest. She had been invisible all her life, just a nurse in the corner. Now here was a human soldier, an enemy, a stranger, looking at her as if she was the only ally he had, and it shook her more than she could admit. She bent closer, carefully dabbing his forehead with a cloth. "You should not speak too much," she whispered. "If the guards hear you, they will—" But before she could finish, the door creaked. 2 alien guards stepped inside, their eyes sharp, their weapons gleaming in the low light. Lyra straightened instantly, her face calm, her hands steady as if she had done nothing. The taller guard walked to the bed, staring down at the human. "Is he awake?" the guard asked in a deep, rumbling voice. Lyra shook her head quickly. "No, still unconscious," she replied, keeping her voice even. Her heart beat like a drum, but she did not let it show. The guard leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. For a moment she thought he had heard, thought he knew, but then he smirked, tapping the soldier's arm roughly. The human did not move, did not open his eyes. He was pretending, playing dead. The guard chuckled. "Pathetic creature," he muttered, and turned to leave. The other followed, the door sliding shut behind them. Only then did Lyra let herself breathe again. Her hands shook, and she pressed them against her chest to calm herself. Slowly the soldier opened his eyes again, staring at her. She almost scolded him for being reckless, but the words froze when she saw his expression. There was no fear there, no defeat. Instead, there was trust, raw and unspoken. He had trusted her lie, trusted her silence, trusted her to stand against her own kind, and in return he gave her a look that said more than words ever could. Her throat tightened, her mind spinning. She had crossed a line tonight, whether she admitted it or not. She had protected him, lied for him, and risked her own safety, for a human she barely knew. But deep down, something inside her whispered that this was only the beginning. The human's eyes had planted a seed she could not ignore, a seed of doubt, of danger, but also of something far more dangerous. Hope. And as she left the ward that night, Lyra realized the silence no longer felt safe, because once a human's eyes had seen you, truly seen you, you could never go back to being invisible again. Lyra's shift ended at dawn, but she did not leave. She sat by the human's bed long after her duty was done, her hands folded tightly, her eyes restless. Every rule told her to walk away, to treat him like any other patient. Yet something inside her refused to let go. The soldier stirred, his chest rising and falling with slow breaths. When his eyes finally opened again, he did not flinch, did not fear her. Instead, he whispered, his voice broken but steady. "You stayed." Those two words struck her harder than any order she had ever received. Why did it matter to him that she stayed? Why did it matter to her? She should have left the moment her shift was over. But the thought of leaving him alone in this ward with guards who wanted him silent, it made her stomach twist. "I stayed," she admitted softly. "But I should not have." The human's lips curled into the faintest smile, weak yet full of meaning. "That means you chose," he said. His voice thin but sharp. She blinked, confused. "Chose what?" "To see me, not as enemy but as man," he murmured. Her breath caught, her chest tight. No one had ever spoken to her like this. Not even her own kind. She was always just the nurse, just the one who cleaned wounds and followed orders. But this human looked at her as if her choice mattered. As if she mattered, she turned away quickly, trying to calm her racing thoughts. "You must save your strength," she said, dipping a cloth into water and pressing it gently against his forehead. But even as she spoke, her hands trembled, for deep inside, she knew he was right, she had chosen. The day dragged on, each hour heavier than the last. Guards came and went, peering into the ward, questioning her with sharp eyes. Each time, Lyra kept her answers short. Cold, professional, she told them the human was weak, still unconscious most of the time, and each time, her heart hammered with fear that they would see through her lie. When night returned, the ward fell into uneasy silence once more. Lyra sat by his side again, unable to leave. Her hands carefully adjusted his bandages, cleaned his wounds. The soldier's eyes followed her every movement. Calm but piercing, finally she whispered, unable to hold it back. "Why should I believe you? Why should I trust a human?" The question hung heavy in the air. For years she had been told humans were violent, untrustworthy, dangerous, and yet here she was, protecting one with her own hands. The soldier's cracked lips curved. "Because I trust you," he said simply. Her heart stuttered, her hands froze. Trust, the one thing she had never been given, the one thing she never expected to hear from a human. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she could not breathe. She whispered back, "You are a fool." But her voice betrayed the warmth rising in her chest. The soldier closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Sharper, stronger. "Maybe," he said, "but a fool who chooses to believe in the one who saved him." Lyra pressed her palm to her chest. As if steadying a storm inside, every part of her training screamed at her to step back, to remain cold, to treat him as only a patient. But the truth was clear. She had already crossed that line. She had lied for him, stayed for him, listened to him, and now his words had tied her fate to his. The choice weighed heavy on her shoulders. If she followed orders, she could step away now, remain safe, invisible, untouched by danger. But if she followed her heart, she would risk everything, her job, her freedom, even her life. For a human who trusted her more than anyone else. As the night deepened, footsteps echoed outside the ward. The guards were back, their shadows long under the sterile lights. Lyra's hands clenched tightly, her body tense. She knew what they wanted, to check on him, to silence him if needed. And she knew with sudden clarity what her choice would be. When the door opened, the guards stepped in, their eyes scanning the room. "Still alive?" one asked, his tone sharp, suspicious. Lyra stood tall, her voice calm, steady. "Yes, but weak." "He won't last long," she said. The human lay still, eyes closed, breathing slow, playing the role perfectly. The guards exchanged glances, one muttering, "Good. Let him rot slowly." Then they turned and left, the door sliding shut behind them. Lyra let out a long breath she had been holding. Her knees weak, she turned to the soldier, and his eyes opened once more. Meeting hers for a long moment, neither spoke. The truth hung heavy in the silence. The bond already forged, she had chosen her path tonight. Whether she admitted it or not, and the human knew it too, his gaze soft but unyielding. "You chose me," he whispered. And though her lips did not answer, her silence said everything. The night was heavy, darker than usual. The ward lights flickered, and the long halls outside seemed to swallow sound. Lyra sat beside the human again, her eyes darting toward the door every few breaths. She could not shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting. The human soldier stirred, his breath shallow but steady. His eyes opened slowly, meeting hers in the pale glow. "You're trembling," he whispered. His voice weak but calm. She shook her head quickly. "No, I'm fine," though her hands betrayed her lie. His gaze softened. "They're coming," he said, as if he could sense danger before she could. And then she heard it, the sound of boots on metal, slow and heavy, echoing through the hall. Her heart pounded as shadows stretched across the frosted glass of the ward door. The guards were back earlier than expected, their steps slower, more deliberate. Something about the way they moved sent chills racing down her spine. The human reached for her hand, his grip weak but insistent. "Don't let them see me awake," he breathed. She nodded, pulling the blanket higher over him, adjusting the monitor to make his heartbeat sound weaker. By the time the door hissed open, she had forced her face into calm. 2 guards stepped inside, but they did not leave as quickly as before. They lingered, eyes scanning the room with suspicion. One walked closer to the bed, staring down at the human with narrowed eyes. "Still alive?" he muttered, his voice sharp. "Yes," Lyra answered smoothly. "Barely." He drifts in and out. The guard leaned down suddenly, his shadow falling over the soldier's face. Lyra's breath caught, her fingers tightening around her tools. The human lay perfectly still, his eyes closed, his chest rising slowly. For a heartbeat, she thought he had fooled them. But then the guard reached out and pressed 2 fingers against the soldier's throat. Her stomach lurched. If the human reacted even slightly, if his pulse betrayed his strength, it would be over. The guard's face hardened. Suspicion flickering in his eyes, Lyra forced herself to step forward, speaking quickly. "Be careful, his body is fragile. Your touch could stop his heart." The guard froze, glaring at her with cold eyes for a moment. The silence was unbearable. Then he scoffed, pulling his hand back. "Pathetic creature," he muttered. But his stare lingered on Lyra longer than it should have, as if he sensed something in her voice, something she had tried to hide. The second guard spoke, his tone rough. "Our orders are clear, nurse." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "If he wakes, if he speaks, you will regret it." Lyra lowered her eyes, bowing slightly to hide the storm inside her chest. "Yes, I understand," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. Finally, the guards turned and walked out, their boots echoing down the hall again. The door closed with a hiss, leaving the ward in suffocating silence. Only when their shadows vanished did Lyra dare to breathe. Her knees almost gave way, but then she felt it, warmth against her hand. The human's fingers brushed hers, his eyes slowly opening. "You saved me again," he whispered. His voice raw but grateful. Lyra shook her head quickly. "No, I only delayed them." But he smiled faintly. "That delay means life." Her throat tightened, her chest heavy. Every moment with him dragged her deeper into danger, but also closer to something she could not name. This was no longer just duty. This was a bond, fragile yet unbreakable. She looked at him, his face pale yet alive, and wondered how much longer she could protect him. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the machines, but outside the ward, she could still hear faint echoes. The guards were not far. Lyra glanced at the door, her mind racing. The human saw her fear and whispered, "You don't have to do this. You can walk away." Her breath caught, anger rising with her fear. "No," she said firmly, surprising herself. "If I walk away, they will kill you." His eyes softened, his gaze locking with hers. "And if you stay, they may kill you too," he said gently. Her heart twisted because she knew it was true, but something deeper than fear held her in place. For the first time in her life, someone needed her not as a nurse, not as a tool, but as a person, as a protector. And she could not abandon that, not even for her own safety. She leaned close, whispering, "You must promise me. If you survive this, you will not forget me." The human's lips curved into the faintest smile, his eyes glowing with quiet strength. "I could never forget," he whispered back. The words settled in her heart like fire, burning away doubt as the night dragged on. Shadows passed the door again and again. The hall outside became a prison of footsteps and whispers every time they drew near. Lyra's heart raced, fearing discovery. But every time she looked at the human's eyes, calm and steady even in pain, she found courage. The silent ward had become a battlefield, not of weapons, but of choices, lies, and unspoken trust. And as dawn began to break beyond the windows, Lyra realized something terrifying. She was no longer just protecting a patient. She was defying her world for him. The ward no longer felt like a place of healing. It had become a cage. A secret battlefield where silence and lies were her only weapons. Every step Lyra took felt heavy. Every glance from the guards felt sharper. Yet every time she returned to the human side, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt purpose. Days passed slowly, each one full of risk. Lyra tended to the soldier's wounds with careful hands, hiding his progress from watchful eyes. His body grew weaker, but his spirit never bent. And the more he spoke in whispers, the more she began to see him not as a patient, not as an enemy, but as something far more dangerous, someone she cared about. "You risk too much for me," he murmured one night. His voice hoarse, Lyra shook her head, pressing a cloth to his forehead. "No, I only do my duty." But even she knew those words were false. The soldier's eyes searched hers, deep and unyielding. "Duty would not make you lie for me. Duty would not make you stay when you should leave." Her hands froze. Her throat tightening, she turned away quickly. But his words clung to her, heavy and unshakable. He was right. She had crossed lines no nurse was ever meant to cross. Yet she could not stop herself. Something in his presence, in his trust, made her break rules she once thought unbreakable. That night he spoke of his world. In hushed tones he told her of Earth. Blue skies, oceans that stretched forever. Cities glowing with lights. Lyra listened with wide eyes, her heart aching with a strange longing. She had never seen such a place, never dreamed of colors so free. And as he spoke, his voice softened, as if he wanted her to believe she could see it too. "You would like Earth," he whispered with a faint smile. "It's loud, full of chaos. But it's alive." Lyra's lips parted, a quiet laugh escaping her, a sound she had not made in years. "Alive," she repeated softly. "That sounds like a dream." The soldier's gaze lingered on her face, his voice low and certain. "Then I'll carry you there. If I live." Her chest burned, her eyes stung, she looked away quickly. But the warmth of his promise stayed. No one had ever spoken of a future with her, not her people, not even her family. But this broken soldier, half dead in her ward, dared to imagine one. As the days bled into nights, their bond deepened. Small moments became their treasures, a stolen smile, a shared whisper, a hand brushing against another. Even silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of trust. A trust dangerous enough to shatter both their lives, but danger was never far. The commanders began to grow suspicious, their visits sharper, their questions colder. One evening, 3 guards entered together, standing too close, their eyes narrowing at her every word. "Still alive?" one asked, his tone dripping with doubt. "Yes," Lyra answered calmly, her voice steady though her heart raced. "Barely," she added, lowering her gaze. One of the guards sneered, stepping closer. "Strange, isn't it? He lingers too long, too strong for a dying man." Her pulse hammered, sweat forming on her brow. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "I give him more sedatives than required," she lied smoothly. "That is why he lingers." The guard studied her, suspicion flickering in his gaze. For a moment the air grew thick, the truth trembling on the edge of discovery. Then he chuckled coldly. "Fine, let him rot," he said. Turning toward the door, the others followed. The one cast a long look back at her before leaving. When the door closed, Lyra sagged against the wall, her knees weak. The human opened his eyes slowly, his lips curling faintly. "You're a terrible liar," he whispered. Though his voice carried warmth, her chest tightened. "Then why do they still believe me?" she asked quietly. "Because you believe me," he said simply, his eyes never leaving hers. The words pierced her deeper than any blade. Because they were true. She did believe him, though she could not explain why. In a galaxy that had taught her to doubt, to obey, to remain invisible, she chose to believe the one man everyone called dangerous. From that night on, she no longer told herself she was doing her duty. She knew the truth. She was protecting him not because of orders, but because of trust, her trust in him, his trust in her, a bond that grew stronger with each stolen breath. And in that fragile bond, Lyra found something she had never known before: freedom. But freedom came with a cost. Each day the guards grew more restless, the commanders more watchful. Lyra could feel the storm building, shadows gathering outside the ward. And though her hands still healed wounds and adjusted monitors, her heart knew the truth. The bond they shared would soon be tested, and trust alone might not be enough. Still, when she looked into his eyes, steady even in pain, she found courage, a courage she never thought she possessed. Because for the first time in her life, someone did not see her as just a nurse. He saw her as the one thing keeping him alive, and that bond, dangerous and fragile, was worth every risk. Lyra didn't sleep anymore. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the guards' faces. Their suspicious eyes, their mocking smiles, their quiet steps in the hall. She knew something was coming. She could feel it in the way they stared at her now. Longer than before, colder. The human had healed enough to sit up some days, but only when no one was looking. His wounds were still deep, his muscles weak, but his spirit was sharp as ever each night. He watched Lyra more than he rested, worried for her more than himself. "You need rest," he said once, his voice low as she adjusted his bandages. She shook her head without speaking, her hands moving quickly. He reached out and gently caught her wrist, his fingers warm. "Lyra," he whispered, using her name for the first time. She froze, her eyes wide, her heart skipping. "You've given me more than medicine," he said, his gaze deep and full of something she couldn't name. "You've given me a chance, a voice, a reason." She pulled her hand away, not in anger, but in fear, not of him, but of how much his words shook her. "I'm not your reason," she said, standing quickly, trying to find distance. But even across the room, his voice reached her. "You are," he said simply. "You stayed when no one else did." Before she could respond, the ward lights flickered. Then came the footsteps, fast, hard, too many. She turned just as the door slid open and 3 guards entered. Not the usual patrol, not the same lazy eyes. They looked angry, focused, prepared. The tallest one pointed at her, his voice like thunder. "Step away from the human." Her body went cold, her mind spinning. "Why?" she asked, her voice calm but shaking inside. The second guard stepped forward, holding a data pad. "We received a report," he sneered. "You've been falsifying his condition." Lyra's breath caught. She glanced at the soldier who had already slumped down, pretending to be weaker than he was. "You're mistaken," she said quickly. "He's still critical." But the third guard moved past her and ripped the blanket away. The soldier's eyes stayed closed, but his chest moved too evenly, too strong. The guard's face darkened. "He's faking," he growled, turning to Lyra. "And you helped him." They grabbed her by the arms before she could react. Her tools clattered to the floor. "No," she cried, struggling. "He's still a patient." "You can't." But one of them struck her across the face, hard. She fell, her cheek burning. Blood at the corner of her lip. The soldier's eyes snapped open, and for the first time in days, he sat up with full strength. "Don't touch her," he roared, his voice shaking the walls. The guards froze in shock, just long enough for him to stand. Weak knees wobbling but fists clenched. "Get away from her," he said again. Louder this time, one guard laughed. "Look at you. You can barely stand." But the human took a step forward anyway. "I don't care," he said. "Touch her again, and I will kill you." Lyra, still on the ground, looked up at him through blurred vision. He stood like a broken pillar, wounded but unyielding. She had saved him with medicine and silence, but now he was saving her with defiance and fire. The guards raised their weapons. "You're under arrest," one snapped. "Both of you." But before they could move, voices echoed from the hall, more footsteps. Fast and urgent, a commander entered the ward, her coat flowing, her face unreadable. "What's going on here?" she demanded. The guards quickly explained, pointing at Lyra, accusing her. The human did not back down. "She saved me," he said, blood on his lips but fire in his voice. "She followed her oath while you followed silence." He turned to the commander, staring her down. "If she dies, I die with her," he declared. "Right here." Right now, the room went silent. Lyra's eyes filled with tears, not from pain, but from shock. He had nothing to gain, yet he stood for her. In front of the enemy, in front of power, he stood like a soldier ready to die for someone no one had ever defended before. The commander stared at him for a long moment, then looked at Lyra. "You protected a human," she said coldly. Lyra didn't flinch. "I protected a life." The commander narrowed her eyes, but said nothing more. She finally turned to the guards. "Take them both to isolation." The guards moved forward, but now with less certainty. The soldier stepped beside Lyra, helping her stand despite his own wounds. Their arms touched, their eyes met, and without speaking, They both knew there was no going back. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Because the truth had been spoken, the trust had been tested, and now, their bond was stronger than chains. The isolation cell was cold and small. Its walls were metal, the lights too bright, and there were no windows, but inside, sitting close to each other on the floor, were a human soldier and an alien nurse, no longer enemies, no longer strangers. They didn't speak at first, but their silence was not empty anymore. It was full of everything they had shared: danger, truth, pain, and something deeper. Lyra touched her bruised cheek, still swollen from the guard's strike. Beside her, the human leaned back against the wall, his body shaking from exhaustion, but his eyes stayed open, watching her with quiet strength. "You didn't have to defend me," she whispered finally. He turned to her slowly. "And you didn't have to save me." She looked away, her heart heavy. "I broke every rule for you," she said, her voice barely a breath. He smiled faintly. "Then we're even." That made her chuckle, soft and real. The first laugh she had let out since before the war began in her heart. Hours passed, maybe more, before the door hissed open again, this time. It wasn't guards, but the same commander, her face unreadable, her hands behind her back. She stepped in slowly, studying them both like a puzzle she hadn't solved. "You caused a lot of problems," she said coldly. Neither Lyra nor the soldier replied. There was no point in lies anymore. The commander circled them like a hawk, her boots clicking on the floor. "I should punish you both," she said, "for breaking protocol, for hiding information, for building trust where there should have been none." Lyra raised her chin, her voice calm. "Then do it." The human straightened. "If she falls, I fall too." The commander stopped, surprised by the human's bold words. "You'd die for her?" He nodded. "I already chose to." Lyra's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't look away. She placed her hand over his slowly, without fear. The commander watched the gesture and said nothing for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she sighed. "I didn't come here to kill you," she said quietly. "I came to make a deal." They blinked, not understanding. The commander stepped back and spoke carefully. "This entire facility is under review, not just you. The guards, the doctors, the system." Lyra's eyes widened. "Why?" "Because someone finally spoke up," the commander said, nodding at the soldier. "Word of his defiance is spreading. Humans don't usually survive this long or resist this much." She turned to Lyra. "And alien nurses don't risk their lives for them." The silence in the cell shifted. It was no longer heavy with fear, but light with confusion and hope. The commander took a step forward and lowered her voice. "I can't erase what happened, but I can offer you both something else." She pulled out a data pad and handed it to Lyra. On the screen was a transport request. 2 names, hers and the human's. Destination: rehabilitation station on the outer rings, a place far from this prison. Far from command, far from eyes that judged. "You'll leave tonight," the commander said. "No questions, no records." Lyra stared at the screen. Her lips parted in disbelief. The human leaned forward, barely able to speak. "Why, help us?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The commander looked at both of them, then said softly, "Because I once had someone I trusted too, and I let the system take him away." Then she turned and left the cell without waiting for thanks. The door closed behind her. But this time, it didn't feel like a prison anymore. Lyra stared at the screen again, then looked at the soldier. "Is this real?" she asked, voice trembling. He took her hand again, stronger now. "Let's find out," he whispered. That night, under a sky they had never seen together, they boarded the ship. Lyra wore her old medical robes, and he wore a simple coat, his steps still limping but full of pride. No guards followed them, no cameras watched. Just 2 souls leaving behind a world that tried to break them. As the ship lifted off, Lyra stood by the window, her eyes wide at the stars rushing past. The human stepped beside her and asked softly, "Still think Earth is just a dream?" She smiled, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Not anymore," she said. "Not after this." He watched her quietly, then reached into his pocket, pulling out something small, an old metal pin with a faded symbol. "My squad used to wear this," he said. "I don't have a use for it now." He held it out to her. "But maybe you do." Lyra took it slowly, staring at it with wonder. Her hands closed around it, her fingers shaking. "No one ever gave me anything," she whispered. The human leaned closer. Then let me be the first, and in that moment, standing side by side under the stars, she could not speak, not because she had no words, but because her heart had never been this full. A human's kindness had changed her world, and for the first time in her life, Lyra was speechless.